time, we're going to go into more in depth about some of the issues that we work on that hopefully you all can bring up and that relate to some of the issues that you guys mentioned. So Islamophobia, things that we hear in the news, discrimination, all of these issues that you guys brought up. And then at the end, we're going to split into pairs and do some practicing for lobbying so that it could be kind of nerve-wracking to walk into a legislator's office and just need to talk to them about an issue. So we're going to hopefully practice in pairs doing that so you feel a little bit more comfortable introducing yourself, talking about the issues, and then on the day of in Lansing, you'll feel really at ease and relaxed and be able to do it. And what HIBA is passing out, I'm going to talk about in a second. So first of all, Take on Hate is a community-based organization. Some of you mentioned knowing what Access is. Access is the largest Arab American nonprofit in the country, and it's based here in Michigan, in Dearborn. And one of the things that Access has, one of the projects, is the Campaign to Take on Hate. And we are a grassroots community organizing campaign, which means that we work directly with community members who are impacted by these issues of Islamophobia. And what we focus on is fighting Islamophobia, fighting racism, not just between people, so not just, let's say, a Muslim woman wearing hijab is walking down the street and gets a comment, a racist comment. That's one form of Islamophobia, but also more institutional, structural Islamophobia, which we'll talk about today and Hiba will explain. And those are the types of things that we're working to fight against, and not just for Muslims and Arabs, but also all communities of color. So we work mostly within the Muslim and Arab community, but also with other communities of color that are impacted by similar issues. And things that we do are things like community education. So we'll have a lot of events about these issues, just raising awareness. We work to do policy change. So we've been working with the Student Lobby Day for a couple of years now to help students go and lobby for actual policy change around these issues. We do media and social media work, so we have online digital campaigns, and then we also have a core membership development program. So Noor mentioned that she's a volunteer or a member with Take on Hate. So is Hiba. We have almost 10 members now who have been coming to meetings consistently and actually organizing the campaign that we're working on, which we'll talk about. So what we've been doing for the past year is a project called Aman Zones, and who knows what the word Aman means in Arabic? Yeah. Safety. So safety, security, that's what Aman means. And this project is basically, for the past 6 months or so, we've been collecting community surveys, and those are the things that Hiba just passed out, the small survey sheets. We've been doing a community assessment of the Arab and Muslim community to find out what are the top racism-related issues that people are facing on a daily basis and that impact people. And we've been doing this all sorts of ways. We have volunteers go out to neighborhoods and knock on doors. We have people tabling at local businesses and grocery stores. We have events where we invite people to come and then have them fill out the survey. So we've collected over 2,000 surveys at this point to basically get an assessment of what are the main issues that people care about. And so when we were designing the survey, we took into consideration things like the fact that a lot of people in the community only speak Arabic, so that's why you'll see on the other side of the survey it's translated into Arabic. We did not just surveys. Some people don't want to fill out surveys or don't know how. We did also town halls and community listening sessions to find out, go more in depth and actually have a conversation with community members about what they care about. And so that was the process that we used. And what we found is that these are the issues we asked people about, and the top issue that people in our community cared about, and this is not just in Michigan, but across our 4 chapters, which are one here in Dearborn, Detroit, one in Chicago, one in Anaheim, California, and one in Brooklyn, New York. Across all 4 cities, the top issue that people cared about was racial profiling. And so now our work is mostly around racial profiling and trying to dismantle racial profiling in different ways. And then just to point out, the fact that you guys are here is really awesome because most of the people that filled out our survey actually were youth, people under the age of 24. And that's mainly the base that we're working with, and that's why our organizing team is a youth organizing team. If anybody here wants to get involved, with the work that we're doing, that's definitely something we encourage you to do. If you fill out the survey and put your contact information, you can actually sign up to volunteer with us or to be an organizing member, and so we'll reach out to you. And so Hiba, I'm going to turn it over to Hiba. She's going to talk more about institutional racial profiling, which is the issue that we'll be lobbying on, and then we'll go more into depth about some of the campaigns that we have.
Alrighty. Okay, so just to get like a better understanding of where we are in the room, by a show of hands, who knows what the term racial profiling means? Okay, excellent. So yeah, so we're going to be going a bit into depth into the fact that racism exists within our systemic structures in society and how that impacts us. So this quote, I'm just going to read it out to you. We used to call it flying while Muslim. Now we're transitioning to the exciting existing while Muslim. So does anyone have any idea as to what this may refer to? Yeah, go ahead.
You'd be worried when you're going on a plane that you're Muslim, but now it's just in general, if you're Muslim, you'd be worried.
Excellent. You in the back?
Same thing.
Same thing. Okay, exactly. So that suspicion, we used to have suspicion tethered to the Muslim identity when we were in airplanes, we were in airports, and now it's the day-to-day. Whether you're in a place of worship, whether you're going out to get groceries, or just getting a basic education, that suspicion goes wherever you go. So to get a definition by the American Civil Liberties Union on what racial profiling is, it's the discriminatory practice by law enforcement officials of targeting individuals for suspicion of crime based on the individual's race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin. And the reason why I put suspicion in red is just to show you that there's not necessarily solid facts that prove that an individual, is worth following around or worth profiling, but the fact that there's suspicion is enough to justify a lot of law enforcement going towards this action. And what we tend to do when we're discussing racial profiling is this discriminatory omissions. So we focus a lot on the victim, we focus a lot on the crime, but we're not looking at the source of the issue, and that's the perpetrator, and the question is, where is that sort of ideality, that sort of mentality coming from? So this is a sort of an image to show you what the racial profiling system is like. So if you're white, you're all right. If you're yellow, best to be mellow, which means that you're expected to be passive. If you're brown, better stay down. Red, good as dead. Black, better get back. And for Arabic, we don't even have race, so we're supposedly under the white race, and so we don't even have sort of a stance on the racial board. Yet we're still, either way, we're not in luck. So just a bit to look at the demographics within the U.S. population. Only 1.1% of the U.S. population is Muslim American, 20% of which are Black. And the fact is, and this just goes to show you, and 8% are Hispanic. The struggle that Muslims face are the struggles that African Americans face, the struggle that Hispanic people face, and many people of color. These are just some stats regarding racial discrimination by Muslim. You have 1/3 of Muslims are treated with suspicion. There has been an 8% increase in racial discrimination over a 10-year span, and about half of Muslim Americans have reported that they have felt some sort of racial profiling or some sort of discrimination. African Americans, 60% of African Americans say that they or their family member have been unfairly treated by police. 45% say that the court system and the legal system have treated them unfairly on the basis of the color of their skin, and 42% have experienced racial violence. We should actually be very alarmed by these outrageous percentages. So this is a video by none other than Donald Trump, just to show you a little bit of his viewpoints on the minorities of our country.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am officially running for President of the United States, and we are going to make our country great again. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. Who's number one with Hispanics? Trump. Trump. I love the Mexican people in their spirit, but the country of Mexico is killing us. I want to build a wall. I'm going to build a wall. I want to build a wall. We need the wall. And Mexico will pay for the wall. than waterboarding.
I want surveillance of certain mosques, okay? If that's okay. Because they are recruiting by the thousands. They're leaving our country. And then when they come back, we take them back. Oh, come on back. Where were you? I was fighting for ISIS. Oh, come on back. Go home. Enjoy yourself. I will absolutely take database on the people coming in from Syria if we can't stop it, but we're going to. I've made it known. If I win, they're going back.
Okay, so the remainder of the video talks about things that are not really relating to what we're focusing on, so I decided to focus on the two communities of the communities of color that he discusses, and that is Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants, and then also Muslim Americans. So what have we learned from that video? These are some quotes that Trump has said. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're bringing rapists. I will absolutely take database on the people coming in, and he's referring to Muslim Americans and Arabs, Muslims and Arabs. If I win, they are going back. The question we need to ask in all these circumstances is, who are they? Who is he defining as they? In the rhetoric that he uses, there's a lack of clarity, there's contradiction, and there's definitely racism. So these are just a couple of stories I thought to share with you. Can you guys read them? Can you guys see them from your spots? Does anyone want to read one of them? Yeah? Can you read the one on the top left? Yeah. Yeah, you can do the second one. Just start off.
Late in 2003, local police raided Stratford High School in Goose Creek, South Carolina. Reportedly, the Goose Creek Police Department conducted the SWAT-style raid on a tip that there was an ongoing drug activity at the school. Activity that happened to coincide with the daily arrival by bus of many of the school's African-American students. Police swooped in with guns drawn, used handcuffs or flex cuffs to immobilize dozens of students, and brought in K-9 units to search for drugs. None were found. A New York Times story about the raid noted that while black students make up less than a quarter of the 2,700 students at Stratford High School, 2/3 of the 107 students victimized in the sweep were African American.
Exactly. So what do we see here? A person in the high school purposely, when they knew that there was a drug activity going on in school, happened to call the police department at the same time that African American students were coming off the bus, and the police officers automatically made an association between the drug incident at school and the African American students. And obviously you can tell from the text that none of the students had any drugs on them whatsoever, but there's that racial profiling that law enforcement have committed to. And then you can read the second.
The bottom one?
Oh yeah, sure.
Shortly after 9/11, the Justice Department began a concerted campaign to round up and imprison hundreds of men who said it were suspected of connection to the attacks. The vast majority were of Middle Eastern descent and were held for weeks at a time under a quasi official, no lawyer, no release on bond policy. All were held on relatively minor immigration violations, and none were found to have any connection to 9/11 whatsoever.
So once again, the incident of 9/11 was committed, let's say, by a couple individuals of a certain descent. Automatically, we have committed to generalizing the entire group to the actions of a few, and that's just the day-to-day situation for many minorities and groups of color. And I'm just going to read out the last one. So in the summer of 1998, a 37-year-old African-American U.S. Army sergeant and his young son were driving through Oklahoma on the way to a family reunion. State troopers stopped the sergeant, a career soldier and decorated veteran of the Persian Gulf War and the U.S. intervention in Somalia, for no apparent reason. He was handcuffed and his son was locked in another car with a barking police dog. The troopers dismantled his vehicle in their 2.5-hour search, turning off their dashboard video camera halfway through. They found nothing. So again, it's that suspicion just because that individual was African American, and the fact that they turned off that video camera while going through his car and treating him the way that they did is very suspicious. So where do we see cases of institutionalized racism? We're saying that racism exists within the system, but where is it? So we have three sort of expressions of this racial profiling. The first one, I'm sure many of you know, the Muslim ban that was put out in 2017 that prevented the entry of individuals from 7 largely Muslim countries. This is a violation of our First Amendment, which is our freedom to express our religion, and a violation of the Fifth Amendment, which is equal treatment under the law. And then we have the USA Patriot Act, and it basically provides the government with the investigative powers in deporting and detaining individuals who they may believe be a threat to society on the basis of little or no information. So there doesn't necessarily have to be solid evidence. It's the fact that there's a suspicion and the fact that racial profiling is very much justified in our country that allows them to do this. And then stop and frisk policies. In the state of New York, police officers are given permission to briefly stop bystanders on the basis of reasonable suspicion. When you're stopping an individual on the street that you don't know, you're stopping him on the basis of what, or him or her, on the basis of their physicality. So you're committing racial profiling, and that's actually justified by our system. And lastly, I just wanted to show you guys a couple pictures that sort of sum things up. In the picture in the middle, with the man, he's labeled as terrorist, and somehow the label of Muslim has a negative connotation, when by definition a Muslim is a person who follows a certain faith, which is Islam. He's a submitter of God, but that has a negative connotation now. He's labeled with Saddam. Again, the actions of one are put onto the actions of the many. You have skin color is not reasonable suspicion. This goes with our stop and frisk policies. On the top left, many Americans are able to express their patriotism, but when a girl in a scarf or a woman in a scarf wants to, she's not allowed to, or it doesn't make sense to because it's some sort of opposition. On the top right, many of you may be aware of the Chapel Hill shooting, where 3 individuals were shot. I actually was in Lebanon at the time because I lived there, and we didn't hear about it till 3 or 4 days after the fact. So the fact that the media didn't decide to cover that and didn't feel like it was worthy news is questionable. Martin Luther King Jr., this was definitely not his dream. And again, we see in the middle here the fact that there's this stereotype of Muslims that we oppress women and we don't give them the right to speak or the right to express their mind. The fact that he's covering her mouth with his mustache is largely stereotypical. And finally, the bottom, the Republican Party promotes hate against Latinos, but we are the future of America, so stop your racism. And that concludes my racial profiling presentation, and then I'll hand it over to Noor.
Okay, so before we go to this, what are some of the, I guess, narratives or stereotypes that Hiba mentioned? Are any of those like familiar to you guys at all? Are they things you've heard?
Stopping at the airport.
Which ones?
Getting stopped at the airport.
Getting stopped at the airport, okay. What else? Yeah.
Getting, no, you can't have this job basically, when I know I should have gotten it.
Okay.
And also getting pulled aside when walking into concerts, etc., when no one else does.
Okay, great examples. What else? Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm gonna say being at a family dinner at a restaurant and being eyed down just because you wear a hijab.
Yeah. Okay, so the examples that you all have mentioned go everything from what we call interpersonal racial profiling or interpersonal racism, which means, what do you guys think it means? Interpersonal. Who can take a guess?
Personal.
It feels personal. What else? Can you speak up? I can't hear you.
I said just like you don't know them personally, but you actually like just racist towards them.
Yes. Great. Yeah.
Racism within society.
Within society. So it's one form of racism within society between people, so between individuals. This is just, a person walking down the street, a person at a restaurant sees a Muslim family. Those are the kind of acts we're talking about. And then they go all the way to things that we call, that Hiba has talked about, structural racism. And that's when you see things like being stopped at the airport. We're told it's random, right? Like, oh, it's just a random check, but we all know that it's not random. Only certain people are stopped for reasons of, the religion we practice, race, ethnicity. And what are some of the narratives that are used to justify that? So why are, Muslims more likely to be stopped at the airport, for example? What are some of the things we hear about why that happens? Yeah.
What's happening in the Middle East and what the dictators say under the name of Islam, and that's misleading, and even though the politicians know it's wrong, they just take it as a reason and to justify their actions.
Okay, so what's happening overseas, and what about Muslims is, scary? Why do we have to make sure we double check and we're super cautious around them? Yeah.
Because they just tend to generalize it, so they would link like bombings in certain places or like ISIS with Muslims when they have no connection. Absolutely not. So they just think, and then they're like, oh, let me just check, but it's not right at all. They just
Right.
assume it is.
Right, so violence being associated with Muslims. These are some of the narratives that justify a lot of the policies that we see. And so with Take on Hate, we're working on a specific form of racial profiling that we're trying to end. And this is racial profiling through surveillance. So who knows what surveillance means?
Cameras.
What's up?
Cameras.
Cameras, okay. What else comes to mind?
Security cards.
Watching someone, what did you say?
I think it was like the security cards.
Security, yes. Those are all can be forms of surveillance. So we're talking about a specific community, in this case the Muslim community, being watched by the state. And so this is a form of profiling because Muslims are watched in more and more frequently and more closely than any other group. And this same problem also happens with Black Americans. Other communities of color are also under surveillance. But for our case, what we're working on is the Muslim community. And so just to briefly kind of explain the basics of racial profiling through surveillance, we have one type of surveillance called what we call hardline surveillance. So to give an example, in around 2010, it was discovered that the NYPD, the New York Police Department, had a huge ongoing investigation of basically all of the city's Muslims. All of New York's Muslims were under surveillance. And so what that looked like was NYPD officers would be undercover in Muslim communities. So for example, there were Muslim students associations at colleges who had people undercover from law enforcement who were collecting information on Muslims within those organizations. Also at mosques, at community centers. Law enforcement was there collecting information over blanket surveillance of all of the city's Muslims. It didn't matter if somebody was specifically tied to a crime or whatever, it was just in general suspicion of Muslims and profiling them for that reason. Then there's, and one thing to note is that there's been an increase of this under the Trump administration, which from the video we see like that's not surprising at all. But the other type of surveillance that we want to talk about is what's called soft surveillance. And this is, there is a new program, now it's not so new, but relatively recent, that was started under the Obama administration actually, called Countering Violent Extremism. So it's using the narrative that some of us brought up, Muslims are violent, we have to counter this violent extremism. Muslims potentially could become radical or extreme, and so we have to keep an eye on them and make sure they're not, up to trouble. And so what this looks like is these programs are funded by the federal government and make relationships between law enforcement and local and state level communities. So what that looks like, for example, the Department of Homeland Security, which is a federal department, could give grant money, so money to a local community-based organization, and say that this money is going to be used to actually report on the activities of people in that community. And so, of course, the narrative that's used is that we want to report on anything suspicious. Only if the person or people are suspicious, report that information to law enforcement so that we can make sure that we take care of it. But, and this is given to things like we said, mosques, colleges and universities, local police departments, state police departments, and just to point out why we're working on this here with Take on Hate is that Michigan actually received federal funding for this program called Countering Violent Extremism, and for short we call it CVE. And the funding that Michigan received is to coordinate all surveillance activities at a local and state level across the state. So when we say what's suspicious, these are some of the things that come up in these policies and in these programs. So just take a look at them, take a second to look at them. Do any of these jump out to you as familiar? This is what could be suspicious and could get somebody to be, under surveillance or be profiled by these policies. Anything that you guys relate to, any of these, do you think you could describe yourself with? Yeah.
Like on Fridays when people normally wear clothes to go to the mosque, that normally people discriminate against that. Like if you're walking to the mosque and somebody sees you on the street, so they would like say something to you or something like that.
Yes, so dress. What else? Yeah.
regular mosque attendance.
Mm-hmm.
Go there on a daily basis. They're gonna like label you or what you say.
Exactly. What else?
Reading the religious scripture, I on put on your phone and everything on your phone.
Yeah. So what we're seeing is that these are very normal, everyday activities. Probably most of us in this room would fit into at least one of these things. So, things as simple as growing a beard or wearing a hijab, or to things that might be more serious, like maybe you or someone in your family has a mental illness, needs mental health support, or maybe one of us is very active on different political issues. Those things are very normal activities that we have the right to do as Americans, and at the same time, because of the identity of the Muslim community and because of racial profiling, they're being seen as suspicious. And so that's why this is such a problem, and that's why this is one example of racial profiling. So how do you guys think this impacts you? And let's start with as individual people. What do you think are some of the effects of this, of people being profiled and being surveilled as individuals? Yeah.
I think the effects that it has is that it discourages religion, and more importantly, it discourages like who you are, like your culture. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess you could call it stress.
Yes. You want to say more about that? Okay, that's a great point. Stress and any things related to mental health, anxiety, all of those factors. Yeah.
Well, the fact that like some people are gonna see government doing it, so they're gonna act that way as well. So it impacts like the way that community handles Muslims or anyone of any color or race. It's just going to like make it feel like it's okay because if the government does it, it's okay if I do it.
For sure. Okay, so then think about, let's skip to the last one, which is as a community, as a whole. How do you think this impacts our communities? So think about, communities you grew up in, whether that's a masjid, a mosque, a faith-based organization, or other community organizations, even within your family and extended family or friends. How do you think what impact does it have? Yeah.
The women start wanting to take off the scarf so they won't be labeled when they go in public.
Mm-hmm. What else? Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to like feel comfortable practicing your religion outside of like your house.
Mm-hmm. And what about feeling comfortable? So feeling comfortable with, expressing your religion, which is a civil right that we have, that's one thing. What about feeling comfortable, let's say, organizing around an important issue in your community? Do you think this would affect that at all?
Yeah.
How?
Like Ilhan Omar, when
Mhm.
she wanted to look at the issue of funding Israeli army, she was labeled a terrorist and started holding up signs that she needs to be assassinated.
Yeah. So that's a great point, is like people being targeted for their activism and the fear that causes in a community. So I'm sure maybe a lot of us can relate to the fact that sometimes if if you want to be active on an issue, and has anybody ever gotten from a parent or an elder, just be careful, like don't be too loud on this issue, don't go out there saying things. Is that something that we've heard? Yeah, so that's kind of the fear and the caution that it creates around it. And then what about just simple things like community trust, whether it's within the community or between the community and outside communities, or communities and law enforcement? One of the impacts is that these kind of profiling programs break down community trust, because if people feel like anything I say, for example, just because I'm Muslim, or anything I do, if I'm reading the Quran in a public place and somebody sees me and that's going to get me in trouble, then it's also going to impact what the relationships that people have within a community. And we know that's one of the most important things in terms of building power within a community, is trust and relationships. Yeah.
It will cause more people to divide as a community because they'll feel like they're not comfortable and they can't speak out. So it would just cause more people to become isolated.
Yes, isolation, division.
Separate from their religion and
Yeah.
culture.
Those are great points. Okay, so just some more, which we've already mainly mentioned, but some of the effects. Routine activity, everyday activity, practiced by Muslims is interpreted as suspicious. Constitutionally protected activity by Muslims is the basis for spying and investigation. So constitutionally protected activities are freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech even. Spying is chilling and suppressing Muslims' free exercise of religion, free speech, and association rights. And then counter-radicalization, which is just another word for countering violent extremism, which we've been talking about, aims to divide Muslim communities and actually pit them against each other. So let me turn it over to Hiba for this last part, or do you want, I don't know if you want to skip this or skip it?
Yeah, here, sort of what it's like to have a community. And then again, like why the government continues to pursue racial profiling is this implicit bias, the fact that our system has made us to think this way. It's actually very difficult sometimes to rip that racial profiling out of your mindset. So that's something that we need to address. It's the fear, and it's also the fact that it is structural.
Okay, so really quickly, our asks, and they're also going to be on this handout that we're going to give you so you can remember them, are one is to end funding for CVE and all other surveillance programs in Michigan that infringe on our community's freedom of speech and religion, and then to support bills and resolutions that foster a culture of inclusiveness, diversity, and that actively fight against continuing discrimination, and finally to promote Michigan as a state that welcomes all people and protects all its residents. So those are some of the asks that when at the end of the meeting we want the legislators that we're talking to commit to these things for us, and which we'll follow up on too. Okay, so I don't know how much time we have left. Okay, perfect. So we have about 20 minutes. So what we're going to do now is practice actual lobbying around racial profiling. Yeah.
What does CVE mean?
What does it stand for?
Yeah.
It stands for Countering Violent Extremism. Okay, are there any other questions? Actually, I'll stop there for questions. Okay, and feel free to ask as they come up.